Okay, how is this? Is this readable? The back? Okay. All good?
A bit bigger.
Bit bigger. Is that okay? Okay. So this is the canonical example of what I was saying you may find on the internet. Please take pictures if you want, but don't use this code. Okay? It is bad. But that's why I wanted to show it. This is a classical thing you might find on the internet about how to use JDBC with Java. And the answer is there's a couple of problems here, or a couple of things that are wrong. Well, you cannot see all the lines, but this is typically enough. So can anyone point me a couple of things that could be improved here or fixed in this code? Connection pool, okay, yes, that's an improvement. I'll talk about that later. But there's hard coding, okay. Already the name here is telling me that I'm using some hard-coded stuff. We'll fix that later too. But there's even more deep. Say it again? Yeah, try with resources. That's nice, okay. What if we're using Java 6? Right, that's the answer. So try catch without resources. More specifically, we're not dealing with errors here. So that's one of the problems. We are not dealing with errors, and errors may happen. Indeed, errors will happen. Sorry to say, the world is not perfect. So there is no code for dealing with errors. You notice this throws SQL exception? Don't do that. Right? So the JDBC spec, I know it's verbose and forces you, throws SQL exception everywhere, and you need to put catch everywhere. Yes, I know. Yes, it might be painful, but yes, it's there for a reason. Even if you don't agree with checked exceptions, they are there. And if you just throw them away, your program is going to blow out in production 3 a.m. on Christmas Day, and it's not going to be nice. So, do something with them. That's, okay, so we've seen that there's hard-coded configuration, there's no connection pooling, there's no checking of errors. Anything else that might be wrong or could be improved in this code?
Видите, пожалуйста, соединение с баз данных происходит в автокоммит моде или нет? И почему?
Yes. So, yes, I'm not specifically disabling or setting the auto commit mode. That's an optimization. I'll talk about that later. But just if you check this code, right now I'm just printing the metadata. I'm not even doing a query.
Ну, этот режим, он не отключается им самим вручную. Он
автоматически автокоммит или нет?
Сейчас здесь вообще речь идет о создании метаданных.
Ну, разве в connection не определяется?
Нет.
The default, I think it's an auto commit mode.
Да, по умолчанию он должен быть в автокоммите. То есть вручную он его не отключал.
More ideas. Okay, that's the first line because I want to move forward. Does the first line tell you something? That class for name? That line is everywhere. And it's not wrong, but it's not needed if you're using Java 6 or greater. Because Java 6 introduced a method called service loader, which loads dynamically the classes required under these cases. When a service is provided and the JDBC driver is registered as a service. And the JDBC spec also supports this. So this line, you can completely remove it and it will work the same way. However, it's still all in the internet and it's not required if you're using Java 6 or more.
You say that you don't use query example, but when you call get metadata, JDBC driver send query to
Yes. So, okay, so I said there's no queries here, and I'm just calling the metadata. And then if there's metadata, it might mean that the Postgres is sending a query behind the scenes, so I'm effectively doing a query. Okay, agreed. Might be the case. Depending on the metadata, I might get that metadata information from the query, from the protocol in the first message. But anyway, yes, there might be a query. Anyway, this is a read-only query. So the auto-commit mode, I don't care about in this case, particularly. But technically speaking, you could be right.
We have some difference because you read data. When you read data in transaction and you don't finish transaction, and you finish transaction exactly after query.
Yeah. So strictly speaking, if I would want to query different parts of the metadata that may involve different queries, which I'm not sure, but especially if you're not sure, you may want to protect that. You may want to start a repeatable read transaction or serializable transaction to get a consistent view of that metadata. Yes. Nothing against. I mean, if you really need that and say, I want a consistent view of the metadata or whatever queries I'm doing, and then you, of course, request a transaction with isolation mode, repeatable read. Repeatable read-only will be enough. And that will be a mode where no rollback would be possible by the server. So that would be very convenient. And yes, in that case. Agreed. Interesting point. Okay, all right. So far, so good. Bad code, don't use it. So let's look at how this code should be better extracted. So let me just hold on, because it's not going to work, right? No, it's going to switch here. Okay, it doesn't matter. So the first fix, I know the font's small here, but the first fix is to just remove that line about the class for name. Again, unless if you're using Java 5 or less, you need that line. If not, you just remove it. So okay. Now let's make the code a little bit better. So this is a more correct example, which already doesn't load the driver specifically and uses the try with resources that was suggested here before. The try with resources started in Java 7. It's a method for automatically managing some resources that you would typically need to close manually after if you're not using this try with resources. So here, the connection to the database, it is initialized, and then it is closed when this part here finishes. So the connection will be closed automatically by the program, by the try with resources when the job is finished. Now, this doesn't mean that the SQL exception might be thrown in the process. Also, what I'm doing inside this first try, which acquires a connection, the second try, just basically getting the metadata, as it was pointed out, this may go to the database, and that query may fail, there will be a query timeout, the network connection may be down, there may be some things that could happen, so that could be an exception. So I also need to check that this code here may also throw an exception. I'll need to handle that exception. And then, even closing the connection, which I'm doing here specifically, oh, sorry, by the way, there's no try with resources here. If doing it without the resources, even closing the connection may also throw an exception, because might need to do some cleanup, and that cleanup may throw the exception. So I also need to check this exception here. So as you can see, and we haven't even done a specific explicit query yet, which I'm going to do right away. There's a lot of complexity in dealing with the code. And that's why most of the examples you find on the internet, in order not to scare people away, don't include this. But the end result is that they are not safe. So let's move over. Again here. So let's do a query here now. Okay. If we now move a little bit farther, and hold on, I'll make this bigger again. Let's say we want to make a query here. This is a more, let's say, canonical example. Still, sorry about that before, we're not using here the try with resources. I'll include that example just in a few examples now. But because I want to show you the full complexity of what's underneath. So now I want to do a query. The way to make a query is, first of all, I grab the connection. So here's the connection first. I create the connection, right? At this point, the connection should not be null. If I'm able to progress, otherwise I'll get a SQL exception, right? So I have the connection here. From the connection, I create a statement, right? And from the statement, which is a way of executing query, then I'm going to execute this statement. The query I'm doing is this. By the way, if you clone this code from GitHub, you'll see a directory called DB, and there you have a sample database, which is also open source. And this is the one I'm using here to generate some data. So you can run these examples. First, create the database and import all the data. There's instructions in the README on how to do this. So you just import the database, and you run this query with the execute query method. And then you iterate through the result set. This is going to be called JDBC. If you have any questions, just let me know. Otherwise, I'll just move over this. And you get the columns in this way, for example. There's other ways, but let's say by index. Then the query may produce a SQL exception. If I'm able to proceed or not, I will need to, in any case, to free the resources. And the resources are the connection that I'm closing, as I was doing before, but also I may need to close the statement. The statement is also a resource, and I may need to close the statement. But the statement might or might not have been initialized before, depending on whether the connection set succeeded or not. So I need to test with this if whether the statement was created. So basically what I'm saying here is finally, which means whatever it happens, even there's an exception or no exception, close the connection at the end, and before closing the connection, I'll try to close the statement if it was initialized. And then even closing this statement or this connection may also throw a SQL exception, which I also need to catch. So if you really think about this code, really performing the query, it's this. The rest is managing the resources and the possible errors. So, not nice, right? Could be done better, or that's the intention. So let's move over and, by the way, before moving over, any other possible improvement here? This is not the final code, okay? So there's going to be a better solution, but any improvement that you may see could be done here apart from the obvious try with resources?
Don't set
Sorry?
Result set is closer resource.
Yes, that's correct. The result set also should be closed but by definition of the spec, the result set will be closed with the statement. So closing the statement will close the result set. That's by the spec.
We can use transactions here.
Yes, we can talk about transactions, that's correct, but there's even more things there interesting to comment on. Yes?
We can use not column index, but column names.
Yes. So I could use column names. Here I'm getting the results by index, and I could get the column data by column names. Now, if I have some time later, I'll try to show you that up to some version of the JDBC driver, that would create a small performance problem under some circumstances. It was fortunately fixed. But yes, that could be an improvement in general cases. Okay?
What are the actual resources that you freed when you call connection closed? I mean, what happens below?
Well, what happens below is basically you will close the socket. So each connection will create a socket connection to the database. And?
And all? I mean, do you send any messages
Yes.
to Postgres or?
Yes, there's a...
Or it is pure network communication?
You send a message to Postgres saying to close the connection itself, because Postgres allocates a process server side for your connection.
And if our virtual machine terminates abnormally, I mean, you throw exception out of main method. Did the operating system actually close it for us, TCP connections and so on?
So on the Java side, there will be no problem, like for example, if your JVM crashes, all those resources.
All the operating memory will free it and TCP connection also?
Yes, and but on the Postgres side, it will not. But
so in what state TCP connection would have on the Postgres side?
well, on Postgres side, the TCP of course has some keep alive mechanism, and at some point, which timeouts are depending on the TCP configuration of your Postgres server, will time out and will detect that the connection is broken and will close it. So eventually, it will be fixed, but it will take some time.
Some people have opinion that nested try catch blocks is not a good code pattern.
So some people argue that nested try blocks are not a good code pattern. I agree they are not nice. Now, if you would say, oh, so here you're catching this SQL exception, and you're also catching this exception, you just remove this, right? Well, that's not correct, because in that case, I would shadow one SQL exception with the other. This is the way the stacking mechanism works. And if I do that, I may not be able to infer whether that SQL exception was caused by an inner reason or an outer reason. Now, there's better ways to fix this. So, I've gone through this very quickly, precisely to see if you cannot catch it, but we're using execute query here, which is a method of basically that you should only use to execute dynamically generated queries. If not, you should use a prepared statement. And the main reason behind this is that this is subject to SQL injection. So I'm just saying execute the query, and if you look at the query here, it has some parameters, some values that are passed by string concatenation, and this is not a good practice unless you specifically need to generate dynamic queries. Okay, to fix this is typically very simple. Here's the query. Rather than specific parameters, you put a question mark, and then when you create the statement, you say prepare statement, and then you set the parameter like this. This is very, very normal JDBC practice. I won't get much deeper into this. Just use prepared statements unless you're generating dynamic queries, pass the parameters by question mark, and before executing the query, just set the values with set int, set string, set whatever, set object, and the rest of the code is the same. So let's switch to the try with resources. I also switched, so as you can see, we're step by step improving the code. We deleted the original class for name. We started catching exceptions. Now we're using prepared statements. So far we're closing the resources. Here I'm also introducing, rather than a hard-coded configuration for the class, I'm using a properties file. So this properties file is well, very simple class to read the information from a properties. This properties is bundled within the POM file. Very simple. Don't worry, this is not production password. And here's some code to open and process this properties file. That's not specific to JDBC or Postgres nor Java, so you'll check the code on GitHub. It's very simple. So the novelty here is that I'm using this try with resources. This try with resources basically closes automatically the resources that I'm using, like the statement I was doing before, the connection I was doing before, and the statement. So whatever I include between these parentheses is a resource that will be automatically closed if and only if it uses the implements the interface called auto-closable. So in other words, I open the connection here and I don't need to close it. It will be closed automatically. The same with the statement. Also another try for the statement and it will be automatically closed. Of course, it doesn't mean that the exception, SQL exception, will not be thrown. It might be thrown, so I need to still catch it and deal it appropriately with the exception. The rest of the code is more or less the same. Now, so this would be, let's say, a better example of how to use canonical JDBC with Postgres. Could be applied to any database. So I would say this is better, not perfect, but better code to at least connect to a database via JDBC, to a query, manage the errors appropriately, and be safe with the queries using prepared statements. It's nothing fancy. However, my main problem with this code is that we are interleaving the database code, which is basically setting these parameters, but more specifically getting the data from the database within the business logic. So it would be great if we could separate a little bit the kind of objects we might be using in our business logic from the interaction with the database. In other words, to separate this a little bit. Typically, I don't get, so this code is right now generating a CSV of the results of the query. If I just run this code, for example, you see I just get CSV, comma-separated values of the results from the database, but I might want to do something else. So rather than just returning here the strings, I might want to generate objects. You know, after all, we're object-oriented. We generate the object which contains this information, and then I'll print it however I want. So this next example, I'm just going to go very quickly over it. I just create a POJO, an object, which will store this data that I get from the database. And here I include a method to basically instantiate the object from the database. So this data I'm getting from here, to get array or get string or get whatever, get double, it is something I build into the object. And then within my code that interacts with the database, there is no specific code to print anything or to do nothing with the data, but just to create the objects and return to the business logic of the application, which is a better practice. Don't mix the code of your business logic and your database. In this case, it's not still perfectly separated. I'll go with that after, but it does lose a first separation. So now I'll create some objects and then I print them the way I want in a code separate from the code that interacts with the database. So with the database, I get a list of objects and then I iterate the list of objects and print them the way I want. Very simple practice. there's even better ways to improve on this, because now this object, this POJO, it's more akin to what object-oriented programming is, but still I don't like it, because this POJO is database dependent also. So I should probably create a third kind of object, which would basically map from the database results to my business logic objects, so that my business logic objects are independent of the database and they don't depend on it. And this third object is typically called a DAO, or data access object. And it's a well-known pattern in databases. So I should probably create that data access object. I won't get into the details because, again, there's tons of things I want to tell you about today. All this code is on GitHub. But basically, this data access object could be as simple or complex as you want. In this case, for example, now I'm crafting the columns of the result table in an enum, Java enum, so that I will be accessing them by name rather than by index, which is a suggestion I got from here. Well, I got from the suggestion before, sorry about that. And then this DAO basically, it generates instances from the result set. So this DAO has the knowledge of how the object is and how the results are coming from the database, and so it matches those and makes my POJOs, my country languages in this case, independent from the database code. So they could come from anywhere. I could test them very easily because they might not need now to come from the database. This is a better pattern. So basically, my query before, which was something like this, now I would provide the DAO, would provide a method which would receive this number as argument, create the prepared statement, of course, and then execute the query and generate the instances. So now my main method is significantly simpler, even though there's still some lines of code there. But basically, here this is to instantiate the connection from the properties. This is to create the connection. And now I just instantiate my DAO, this object that will transform from the POJO data to from the database results. And I call a method of it. And this will already generate a list of the country languages, which is the data I want to get out of the database. But you see there's no specific mapping here from the result sets to the objects, and there's no also printing of the information. Then I'll create the list of languages, and then I iterate and print them all outside it.
And there is no nested try case.
There is no nested try because there is another one inside in this case. Yes, right. Okay, so,
Excuse me.
yeah.
What reason for not use the GDBC templates or maybe another libraries with simpler working with GDBC?
So like to use an ORM or something like that? To use an ORM or a mapping layer?
No ORM, of course, no ORM. GDBC templates is a simple template
okay.
around with GDBC inspector.
Okay, so the question is whether to use not an ORM, but a simplest layer or tiny layer on top of JDBC to make this all simpler. Absolutely. I'm going to talk about several options that I would recommend. JDBC template is not one of those, but it's another option. I just want to show first all the complexity involved into doing this at the lower level, and then ways to fix it. And different best practices. But indeed, if you see how I continue this already looks like a tiny layer or ORM, right? So that's the point where I want to go, that at the end you shouldn't build this yourself and use a tool that exists or elaborate on that tool. Okay, so where were we? Now, there's Java 8, right? And Java 8 introduces lambdas. And with lambdas, or even without lambdas, of course, but lambdas makes this a little bit more appealing. In order to continue constructing this tiny ORM we're using here, if you look at the DAO code, the DAO, it's here reusing some code which could be used to execute a query. But what if I want to execute an arbitrary query? So I could create something like an interface called query executor. Well, not an interface, a class called query executor, which might want to execute queries in a more generic way and do some processing and maybe do the try with resources and execute some stuff inside. So that's what I have done in this query executor, which is a very simple class that just basically receives query processor, which is an interface that I also define, but in this case could be some functional interface which is already present in Java 8, but anyway. So, basically what I say here is that this query executor is something that will execute the query and then process the results. How do I process the results? I don't know, because it is dependent on who's going to be calling me. So here I'm using a pattern called IOC, inversion of control. So I'll just call the guy who's calling me, like, hey, to process the results somehow. You'll know how. The query processor, it is a very simple functional interface that just defines this method. So I'll give the result set to the caller and say, hey, this is the result set, you process it. So how do we use it? Very simple. The DAO is modified. So now here, when I execute the query, I just, to the execute query method, I just provide the lambda, the code that will execute it when the result set is generated. So I call the query executor, execute this query, and say, hey, when the query is being executed and you have the result set, call this code. And you will call this code, which basically adds to the list of country languages, by calling the method, which is inside this class, that gets the instance from the result set, and I pass the result set. This is, again, going yet another step forward, creating this, let's say, ORM, where now I have abstracted away the capabilities of executing a generic query and processing the results of that query in a generic fashion. And so on, and so on, and so on. So there's many more steps I want to show, but they come later. But this is the idea. From the tiny example at the beginning that we saw that was not correct, there's many, many steps you can take, and many good practices and some bad practices that you can take in order to generate code. I'll be back to the slides. Any question before? We'll be doing, I guess, a top.
Could you disable this annoying inspection in IDEA?
Probably yes. But
I think it's Alt-Enter.
Alt-Enter, it's gonna do the same on every line of code, I guess. It's gonna go. There's a lot of duplicated code because each example is independent, but on the same project. I'll need to go to the preferences, probably.
There is a yellow light bulb appearing when you cover it.
Yeah, but it's to view the duplicates, which I don't want to. No, it's on the preferences, which I typically like because I like to see duplicated code. But in this case, there's a lot of duplicated code because each example is iterative. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so before jumping into something else, I think it's time for a break, right? Because, yeah. So let's make a short 10 minutes break, and we'll be back at -5. Yes. Oh, sure. So let me check because I'm not going to use it.
Увидимся.
This is the link. I'll just let me. It's here. It's this one. Okay.
Maybe you
And
need
the
help
presentation is going to be there.
in disabling this inspection and settings of IntelliJ IDEA. You can type
That's-
inspection.
Let's look. Yeah, let's look.
Files, settings.
Yeah.
Duplicate, you can type.
And disable all information.
For the purpose of
Yeah.
Вон там галочка.
You can uncheck all the combo boxes.
No. All Java.
Check means enabled, yeah?
Check means enabled, yes. But this is JavaScript. So Java will disable.
Maybe you can do this in community edition. And it annoys you till you buy some enterprise.
I don't think so. Yeah, I know for the presentation it's pretty annoying. There was some inspection. Profile. Feel free to check it Yeah. Of course. That's what I was working on the last example, for example.
I work with this name parameter, try to work with this name parameter in the Oracle policy, and I issue it one month. It was not working when several the name is the same query.
Some reserved ports or something.
It didn't work in that place, so I had to write the regular
thank you.
expressions.
But I actually didn't know what I clicked.
It's okay.
So I had to write the regular expressions to parse query find the all parameters and use
Yeah. Wow.
But it has the back disadvantage because we cannot now use parameters in comments. So it's the only one problem.
Well, I can tell you that in Postgres works very well. It was just that example was started from the most simple thing. But again, like this example I was showing right here. Look at scope, for example. Let me take this one, for example. So, okay, no, I see it's not being used here, but you can do it for me. Here you can say, rather than say, get then you'll get a SQL exception.
Yes. What's happening to private statement? As I can see, you many queries in cycle. So failed. Recreate private statement. For example, private statement will be invalid if you add some columns in table.
Yeah. So a prepared statement on JDBC does not necessarily mean a prepared statement server side. Yeah. Okay. So prepared statement is a concept of the driver. JDBC. Yes, and may or may not relate to a server side prepared statement.
So basically, it's related. Let's understand.
Not necessarily, and indeed it might be a performance problem to assume it is related. Currently, if you use a prepared statement, it will only be transformed to a server-side prepared statement if you execute more than 5 times.
Yes.
So after the 5th time, it will be turned into a prepared statement server-side. Now, if you, let's say, you modify the DDL such that the prepared statement server side becomes invalid, right now, there was some bugs before in the driver, but right now, the driver will invalidate the server side prepared statement transform administration.
Because I have some...
I don't know for sure. No, before 42.
42 is fixed.
It is fixed, yes.
So I can tell our programs to update this driver and
it should work. Check release notes for 12.07, 12.08. I think was corrected.
I think we just update the latest version.
That should work. And if it doesn't report the bug, because I mean, it's been reported before. There's been some problems with that, but report it if it's not, because it could be fixed. But it should work with 42. Yeah, no problem up here.
Did you see any statements that hangs in idly in transaction state?
That hang.
I mean, if you open PGAdmin monitor, it says that it is idly in transaction.
See, yeah, but it's not hang. I mean, idly in transaction means you have opened the connection
And didn't close it.
but not close it.
TCP connection or didn't commit a transaction.
Postgres connection. So the Postgres connection is separate from the transaction. So you can open a connection and then
Execute several
transactions, many, 0, open, close. You can open a transaction, run something, close the transaction,
Okay,
wait,
so
run something.
when it writes that it is in transaction state, what actually happens?
It happens that
Nothing executes in it. It
Nothing
just
executes.
open
Yes.
like pitch.
yes,
But
exactly.
how you explain that other transactions wait on locks held by this layer transaction? So that's strange when you see that it's not in executing and others waiting for locks.
It's a little bit strange.
It's a Spring DBC template using legacy code. And when you use my bodies with its mappers, it's
What kind of locks was that transaction holding?
share lock.
Shared locks?
It holds exclusive locks and other ways for share lock.
Yeah, that's a problem. A share lock might be held if you, for example, are running some code that reads data. That's fine, right?
Share lock is held when you insert in something that is storing data.
For example, yes. But then that should not prevent other operations unless you're doing something like rewriting a table or altering a table in a way that requires writing it, like an update, adding a column with a non-root fold.
So it's a little bit strange because it can handle for a lot of time, like tens of minutes, and it spontaneously appear and disappear also.
Well, what I would say in that case anyway, because Spring sometimes, and these engines, in my opinion, sometimes they do many things which are hard to control. I would say put a PG bouncer in front, because it gives you much more control.
I was wondering specifically for the state.
Yes. Yes.
You mentioned about alternative.
Yes.
I don't know about Unix domain sockets.
That's a good question.
That original GDBC Postgres driver doesn't support this.
Yeah.
Other alternative drivers some support.
The alternative so far, no. That was one of the goals of the PG project that I mentioned that's not working as of today, but we started drafting some code for it, and that was one of the goals of this project, to increase support for Unix domain sockets.
You can find patch for.
Yes, but it's not full. So there's
It's not have some bugs. When you run test, original test, I remember two failed tests. One plan can GCC cancel. Send stop command and it hangs forever.
So anyway, I am not exactly about that part, but I know there is some initial support for Unix domain sockets in Postgres, not in Postgres, right? There is not support specifically for Unix domain sockets. There is support for different kinds of connecting technologies. You have to supply some glue code yourself.
We implement based on one support.
And where is that patch?
It's proprietary.
Proprietary?
Yeah. And
Think about contributing.
yes, but Postgres community they reject this patch because this patch use Neo and they don't want to use Neo in original driver.
When did you submit that patch? Or when it was rejected?
It's not our patch.
Okay. Well, when it was rejected?
3 years ago.
Okay. I would say, I think the mindset of the people of the PGConfRu driver has changed recently. So I would say that they may now be more open. But I would say before that, check because there is some basic infrastructure right now.
I know you use Juke in DB.
Right. I'll mention you also.
And Juke uses static database dynamically.
Yes.
And how you implement
That's a very good question. Juke is great for static tables.
yes.
But it doesn't mean that it has to be useful only when you have those. But the way of generating queries, it's very good. So even if you have dynamic tables, it helps you to generate the queries.
Can you show some examples how you use Juke in
IntelliDB. So the problem is that IntelliDB we have had two versions. We call the version 1 internally and the version 2. The version 1 was running as a server, so something that speaks the Mongo protocol and translates into Postgres tables back and forth. So all the query engine was implemented there. We switched to a new version of the internal code, which now replicates from MongoDB, but it's not. It lets you execute arbitrary MongoDB queries for DB. So that code is now removed. It will be re-added again because we changed the internal algorithm, but it's not as of today. We can check later if you want to. I can show you how more or less. But it's on GitHub. You go to GitHub for DB, but you need to check previous versions. You need to check for version like, for example, before 0.4. Versions previous to 0.4, they use the internal version 1.
0.4?
Yes. So if you check on GitHub versions prior to 0.4, you will find the code that uses Juke for dynamic tables. I mean 0.4 will also work, but not that. And if you want to, we can check later after this. Sure, no problem. Sure.
I have 2 questions. First one, just
I don't see any problem with that. So serial will create a sequence behind the scenes. So it's the same thing. So it's a matter is whether it's a small int or a big int. The problem. Depends, whether there's many functions. So that's basically moving either triggers or functions in the database. So the question is whether to move the business logic to the database or keep it on the application. It depends. Is your database going to be bottlenecked by performance, for example? Because this database, typically you're going to have one master node, right? So is it going to be a bottleneck? If it's going to be a bottleneck, then put the logic on the application servers, because the application servers are easier to scale than the database. Is your database going to be accessed by thousands of different applications written in different languages, where you will have to duplicate all that validation logic to all those languages? Then doing it to the database would be only one effort. Yeah, I know it's a more common pattern there. Typically, I would say try to do it on the application side, because your database is going to be bottleneck at some point. You're going to say it's slow, and then you have all your business logic running there. But no, you can move it out. I'll have time, but I'll try to mention PL Java, which is a way of running code inside the database with Java. The advantage of doing that is that if you do your business logic inside the database with PL Java, and then you feel you need to move it out, then you almost need no changes to the code. Okay, so well, I'll